and share my screen. So to start the session, still in the mode of, let's say, transitioning into the session, but I guess this could be called an introduction. So the introduction part. So I thought about, after the last playtest session, the one about the flight, so to speak, or which one can also think about as filters. As from the perspective, like, if this is a moment inside an organization, like both the kind of actual moments there, but also maybe the structure there, what kind of principles or approaches does that entail in itself? Like that, like essentially what we had was like early game rules that or drafted game rules that allowed to play, essentially make moves, but there is this sort of softness around the moves. It's not like super exact that you have to do the move exactly, and there's not talking around them. But it had this mode of like this possibility to introduce these rules, and they can set their own scopes, essentially scenes, and these can then create their own outputs, etc. So what if one thinks about this as let's say a normal mode in organization? What would that mean, like as a structure? And this led me to kind of think of that in a way, like from collating from the earlier experiences and modes of play, etc., that we have had there. We kind of have maybe enough pieces to start, which means that start essentially like to look at, or at least to speculate, to initiate the XORG as organization. What that means is kind of a question, open question, or question in play, I guess. But that could be an interesting possibility to entertain, because it might open other possibilities of creation, etc., and so on. So, like, to put it to test is essentially something I'm proposing here. And so I visited all the structures we have had, or at least most of them, and made a kind of minimal version, which is at the same time heavily derived from OBOK, but maybe looking at XORG specifically, and then, like I said, minimalized. And I could kind of go through that first. But before that, any comments, questions, whatever so far, discussions?
Not yet. Go ahead, I think.
Yeah, so I'll quickly go through this skeleton that is here up above, like above the other things in the mirror board, which has like this larger frame called XORG in quotation marks, which has this sort of testing mode that if you write something in quotation marks, it's in the speculative mode, about which in a moment. And then, like, there are four frames within it, which are acts, modes, roles, and scenes. And this is not some kind of exhaustive list, or doesn't have to be all of them, but it has a certain proposal within it. So we can start from the acts, which is a kind of experiment on a term that would combine the rules, moves, rights, capabilities, affordances, etc., etc., etc. terms. that that something can be acted essentially. Whether it's a good term or not, that's open to discussion, of course, but it's an attempt towards that. And within the acts, there are currently common moves. Now, like moves meaning they are acts, but a subcategory, but meaning there's sort of like well, like a move in a game, essentially, like moving a piece, essentially. And so far in this minimalist, there are only 3 acts, essentially 3 rules, which are common, but then every scene can have their own acts, their own rules and own roles, and so on. So the role actually here means like being able to take a role, which actually I was thinking about how to write it, but to keep it minimal, I didn't write it yet. I thought, let's explain it. Like essentially, it's like adopting some role, which then depends on potentially the scene, etc. But there's common roles, which will come in a second. Then you have a move of a rule, which is by default a proposal. That if you say a rule, express a rule, it enters in a proposal or a speculative state. That is, it's not binding for anybody yet. But it's but if it's accepted, then it becomes in itself applied to some scene, or for example, a scene of this conversation here that we're having could be one. Then, of course, you could those types of these could be proposing a role and proposing a scene as well, which are just cases, I guess, from there. And then there is the meta move, which here comprises all the general comments. Like essentially, this is meta, what I'm doing now. Which is, I think, a quality that is actually fitting. That in a way, when we normally talk, we are in a sort of a meta mode, at least from the kind of enactment. But meta mode can also be explicitly expressed to propose a meta mode. And let's jump to modes to open up a little bit what that means, because we've been referring to a couple of modes already. So modes are like general, like almost like atmospheres or well, modes, styles that are in effect. So like I said, the meta is this sort of like talking over, talking above something. And of course you could create meta of a meta, but that if there is something being at play or being enacted, which for this system is kind of the same, you can always raise meta, which is talking above or having a process above what is being done. And then speculative mode is the essentially the organizational fiction, something that could be enacted. Like this is like, for example, if you say a rule or you make an offer, nobody's bound by that yet. So in a sense, it's this mode of fiction. And the speculatives can become something that are enacted by the if they are accepted. And then finally, there is the mode of enacting, which is like actually pushing things forward, utilizing a particular rule, move, etc., doing something in the organization itself. So that's kind of I think useful. Like you could survive without them, but I think it's useful to being able to accentuate that something is speculative, which is essentially like a key part of any game or organization as per last week's talk, versus it being enacted, which is kind of the actualization of things in itself. And maybe quickly, before I stop this torrent of meta input, that there are two common roles, minimal version again. One is a player. Like everybody is a player, essentially. Like, and the player can have, like anything player does is input in a way, like can be meta input, can be speculative input or enacted input. And there's a couple of maybe aspects, perspectives to point out there, that there's the possibility of capturing something, like which is the kind of saving function. We've been thinking like whenever this kind of covers even documentation, like everything that is documentation is in capture, but it's also like if you're like, hey, this reminds me of an interesting role, or brings to my mind an interesting role, that is a capture in itself. And then version, which is another just a notion, is that just to point out that there are these sort of minimalist scenes here, like the converse and pursuit and query. If you take one of these, and you can always make a new version of them, which might be even the same rules, but it's for like there is a filled-in topic, so that's already different. So that's a version. So in a way, like everything that these sort of players create creates versions. And then the keeper, which is a new alternate term for host, or like I thought ultimately maybe a better term, which is like related to game master and facilitator. It's like we recognize that somebody is a keeper of this. Like they might be keeping a game on, or they might be the one who has taken kind of hosting of a certain area of the organization, certain scene, and that is a keeper in itself. But keeper is always a keeper of some scene, some like a scoped context, and not everything in itself. Comments, questions so far from the acts, rules, moves, etc., modes and roles?
So clear to me.
I have a question, or yeah, how did you, or let's say, do you distinguish between what we spoke last time, potentiality in terms of potentiality, and speculation? Like, why are you using speculation and not potentiality, and what's the difference? Or yeah, I guess that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question, because essentially the speculative is an alternative term to potential. But I thought like for organization and maybe common understanding, speculative is a better word in like better understood word here. But they are almost interchangeable, like in terms of structurally. So everything we talked about potential last time is essentially speculative. It's like renaming for this context, that if you thought like people would come to XORG, speculative might be like an easier to understand, because there's the whole speculative fiction, kind of this thing. But it's ultimately kind of the same. Like in a way, like because I have my problems with the concept of fiction, and like the potential has this sort of larger general perspective. I think that for practical purposes, speculative can work as sort of a bridge, perhaps, between those two things. Like it says something better than just saying it's fiction. I think it's awkward and clunky in a way. Speculative covers everything that fiction is, like ultimately if one thinks about it. But then it also reaches to the sense that certain things are actual, like things that are, and then things are potential, things that could be, that they have a form, but they are not yet presently active. But speculative is kind of like denoting that as well here.
Yeah, I also see value in distinguish between the tools, since we're using potentiality for the framework. So I guess having different scopes for each concept is useful.
Yeah, yeah, and this can also be changed. Like this is just like trying to dive in rather than kind of just thinking about and remaining in the meta mode. So if we change everything here, that's completely fine. But just to push towards more practicality and practical action. Any other comments, questions? If not, like, let's take the final part of this quartet, current quartet, which is scenes. So in this sort of interest of the minimal, I started creating this sort of very minimal descriptions of scenes, which like when they would be kind of applied, they would probably have more text to a little bit describe what each of these uh, terms mean, but I think like the idea in them is maybe allowing for using replications like that. You know, converse has a role, person has a role. Um, so the general understanding of what a role is can carry over between them. But I think that maybe the best way to describe this would be to just talk through how one of these things could work. And also one note, this is also thinking towards this sort of Discord and channels as micro games. It's kind of compatible with that, also for other things. But yeah, there is a name, like here's converse, and then there's a version number in brackets. I don't know if that's necessary, but it's there. But so there is this game of having a conversation, which is of course not the only way to have a conversation, and doesn't have to follow this, but it's a possibility. That's the whole thing. Like, well, it's potential. So like, and here is like one version of creating a scene of converse, which is like, okay, you can pick a role. Common role is like just like whatever you bring in, like it's kind of the default role. And you could have a keeper, and then there is like 3 points that it could be a lot of other things. For example, we made the role of a combiner. It could be that. It could also be from earlier forms. There was the form of a summarizer, or the role of the summarizer, or the role of the questionnaire. The only thing that I thought that might be useful and written maybe in the longer form of these sort of rules is that I think they might be more playable if they are not so mechanistic. Like, you know, like questionnaire doesn't always have to end with a question. That could be one way of playing it. But rather, if you take the role of the questionnaire, it's almost like a role-playing role. It's like, oh, I think I will try to make more questions. I will try to like when I'm creating some input, I'm thinking of how to make questions, but there's no hard rule that I have to always make a question. But essentially that's the kind of role direction. Then if there is a conversation, there can somebody can always set a topic, and then there can be moves like query, which is like posing a question in itself. And then response, which is intentionally kind of defined separate from answer, because I think response is a wider concept than answer towards questions. It's like you don't have to answer it, you can still respond it if you think what you're saying is useful for it, but it's not an answer to it, like in the sense of it provides the answer for it. So, and then play is like the idea that you could turn the topic of the conversation into a play scene, and that's in it. And then the token is the idea, which has been kind of generalized in some of our structures, is that you can put a token on something, which means that you kind of want to capture it for later. You give value to it in itself. And so what the idea here is like we can always take these rules or variants or some other version to have a conversation, which is kind of opening up this, okay, do we want to have roles or not? If we all keep a common role, it's essentially kind of no roles, but that's completely fine. But then it opens that up, like somebody can say, like, now the topic here is scenes. Or, and then maybe I put a question as like, is the minimal approach to scenes useful? Or the topic could be, does this make sense? Or sorry, the question could be, does this make sense? And of course, there could be other moves here as well. But it's almost like an interaction in the arsenal. Any comments on this?
I think it's great that it's very basic, like very simple, because I already see its modular potential, sort of like expandability and versioning. I'm thinking if, for example, this converse module would be inside of like a guided lecture of a book, how can it be easily expanded with maybe an additional role, a specific topic, and then be sort of like actionable in a different context. So that's great.
Yeah, and that's kind of also how it's meant, that it's simple enough to also kind of provide for variance, and of course one can create something completely different and make a new kind of conversation role, or have a meta conversation, a free conversation. Of course, that's not, nothing here is kind of like in the mind that everything has to be in this kind of scenes. But it's like providing like the possibility to think that the interaction could be changed, and then creating availability of different changes. That's the key thing. And then also creating possibility of structure, but not enforcing a structure. It's like option of structure. And these, I think, are key maybe principles, which could be a category here. It's like there's always an option for structure or options for structure, and there is always options for modifying the interaction by the acts set upon them. And as a quick to keep quick alternate perspective or a different perspective, I'll just take this pursuit, which is essentially kind of like project. So it has a role, once again, similarly, but one could write into this or its versions like certain kinds of roles that are good here. That's always an option. But then it has an aim as a possibility, which is like a goal, but it separates, like you can think of the direction, which is like the direction you're walking from here, and the target, which is like a thing that you aim at. So it's almost like a aim as where do I go from here, versus aim as what is the ultimate goal we're aiming for. So it's creating this option that, okay, let's describe an aim, but we can also consider the aim as like, what's the next step? Or like, what's the direction here and now? And aim as like, let's set a goal, like we are creating this document, which is like an end goal. And then input, and this could actually read potentially creates a branch, but I can change it later maybe. But means that when there is an aim, you can create input, and you can essentially use that input to also create branches. And this is kind of like thinking of let's take a practical example. So if you have an aim of creating a document, let's say we have this aim of creating metagame of games or a certain part of it. Some input could be that this is a branch of describing roles. And then somebody can add to that branch. And so you can create essentially areas. And then check is this sort of like and somebody can always call for a check, which could be like, of course, a general, like, have we met the aim, or what are the check of what are the needs of the aim. And you can then propose, I think we need this, I think we need that, which then becomes a proposal for others. So essentially speculative. And then I've just added the play and the token. Like play could be potentially useful here, like turning it into like almost like a role-playing scene. And then token is like, I think it's useful here, like somebody creates an input and you put a token on it, meaning that I think this was valuable, or which means like also highlighting something. And then finally, like I simplified a query, and this might also work as practical example. If you think of that, there is a Discord channel called Query, and there is like the moves are query, which is like you can start with that word, and then that's a question. And as replies, you can put always responses, which don't have to be answers. So it's described as like whenever you're creating a response, you don't have to think of an answer, but you can think of what is a useful input to it. And then the token, which is like the ability to highlight either queries or responses. And of course, because the meta move is a common, if you write anything without any like prefix query or response, you're just making meta comments, which is probably fine here. So like in a way, like there could be much more here, but it's this sort of thought that, well, for a channel that might kind of like create certain kind of focus to it, and create this sort of dialogues between questions and their responses. But then adding a token to it might create an additional useful interaction. But maybe somebody would like to have more there. That's fine. Like then it's another version. So yeah, that's a kind of take on this sort of minimal scenes. If this makes sense or is understandable.
Yeah, I think it is.
And Pekko, could we maybe talk a bit more about inputs and outputs? I'm kind of interested in knowing if you have thought about like, having all of this open to inputs from other sections. Let's say we have like pursuit that is to read a book collectively, and then someone has the role of underlining interesting text, interesting phrases, and those phrases become the input for a topic in a conversation, for example. So then now maybe different people have to discuss each highlighted part of the text. Like I'm sort of thinking of those input-output interactions, if you have thought about it.
Yeah, actually, you're already kind of seeing quite well how I thought about the interaction in general, like how, like this is how the structure can potentially help. And also having this sort of loose sense of structure, that you don't always have to be shackled by the structure, but you can always have structure, it can be useful. Like this is like a general comment on your comment, that I think this is precisely what I'm thinking, like in terms of how it could function in general. In terms of inputs and outputs, the reason why it's not much here, I mean, it's in the pursuit, but it might even be called something else here, because I think it's a more general thing. And I'm not quite yet sure if it should be explicated or made into a mode, or it's something that just generally happens, like, or it's just the description. So if I take your case, for example, that there's this pursuit of reading a book and somebody has the role of the highlighter, which is a good example. They're highlighting, and then they create a conversation which takes one of these as a topic. One possibility to, let's say, capture that would be to write underneath that input from pursuit this and that. And maybe that is enough, or maybe that's a good flexible way of approaching it. And then maybe when they're making a highlight, they write their output to conversation this and that just to create the record. Like essentially almost treating them as expressible as links, but separating like input and output, which I think is useful, which I think in agreement with you, Pablo. So yeah, that's my thought on it. But if either of you has better ideas, that's certainly a possible area to think of.
Just this image came to my mind of visual interfaces for programming, kind of Max MSP and this kind, very common in sound software.
Yeah.
That have like these inputs, outputs, and you see like flow of information very clearly. Like that could be very interesting as a way of visualizing like the structure of a certain scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, agreed. Like I think like creating captures that such things could be expressed is I think useful. And this is another kind of worms, which is like, I think something that we covered in the session of playing with this flight, that there is no one representation, but there's always possibilities of representation, which I think is a good approach. Or like there's always possibilities of creating mappings rather than the map for the whole thing. So like somebody creating this sort of flow diagram, I don't know what the general name for this interface that for example, sound programs use, but I'm familiar with them. But the sort of boxes and arrows, essentially. If that is useful for a certain topic, that could be created, and it's treated as just like one representation. And it could be the interface, or it could be a tool, instrument to utilized, say, in a conversation or a pursuit, etc., or some other things. Oh, we got Rock is coming, which is positive. Hello, Rock. Can you hear us?
Hey, hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
Let me think how I can bring you in. Like, essentially, we're looking at a minimalist proposal for XORG structure, which is like you could think of as 0.1. And we have gone through that there are this quartet of areas. One is acts, which is essentially contains things that we think of: rules like, moves like, rights like, capability, opponents, etc. The acts is a kind of experimental term that I'm open to change, but it was this idea that how do we comprise these things under a term that doesn't have all the underpinnings of the term rules? And there are some positive things about acts we can talk about later, but it's a testing term. But essentially, it sets like now in the acts like common moves in the organization, which is taking a role, proposing a rule, and meta, which is general conversation like this, is meta considered. But you can also set a meta mode, which comes to the other part of the quartet, which are modes, which is there is the meta, which is like I said, general conversation, because it's of the meta for an organization. If one thinks about it, it's one. But then speculative, which is like things that could be, like essentially proposals are speculative, and offers, etc. And then enacting, which is like actually operating the organization. So these are kind of way of understanding of almost like different styles or channels of how organization works, and is describing towards that. Then there are roles, and these are common roles, but every scene, which we come to later, can have their own roles. Like everything is scene based. Scene is like a scope, essentially. But the common roles are player and a keeper. And the player is everybody's a player. We can go later what that means, but well, it's kind of comprises utilizing everything in the structure in itself. But then keeper is always a keeper of a scene, but this is like a host of like I'm sort of hosting this session, so in a sense I'm a keeper of this session, and also like a callback to the alternate, I think the best alternative term for games master, which is used by Call of Cthulhu and the Beat Between and a couple of other role-playing games. But always I thought it's the best term for that, because it's kind of a the concept actually kind of somehow comprises the idea quite well, and it's short. So yeah, keeper is kind of a GM as well, or GM-like. And then here are some scenes, which is where we were when you came in. And these are kind of minimal scenes, like how you could have this minimal game of like a query, which is like, okay, there is a move of making a query, which you could prefix by the word query, and then there could be a move of a response, which doesn't have to be an answer, but it relates to a query. And then because the meta is a common move, if you just talk around things openly, that's meta. And then token is like, I like that response, or I like that query. You can set a token on it, which is a way to highlight it for others in and of itself. That's super minimal. There are a little bit more open up structures, like the pursuit and this converse, which is like conversation. But the key thing about this is like, it's to think about organization as like always offering optional structuring for interactions, but not enforcing them. Like you can always be in the meta, you can always have open conversation like this, but you can always dive in, like let's take these roles, like I'll take the role of a summarizer now. And then now that I'm a summarizer, I'm playing a bit differently, that I'm thinking of how to summarize things. And or we go to a conversation, so I propose or set a topic because I'm the keeper, the topic is this, and so on. So that's where we were, and then we're discussing kind of like the pragmatics of playing in such a structure, with Pablo's good examples, which was like, if people had kind of created the scene of pursuit of reading through a certain text, and somebody had taken a role of an underliner, like they're underlining certain passages, and then they take some of the underlinings as an input to a conversation, a converse, creating a topic from one of these underlinings, and that becomes a conversation in itself. That's a good example, I thought. Like, so I stole your example, Pablo. So I think you're brought in. Of course, if you have any questions, comments,
thanks, appreciate it. Yeah, also sorry for jumping in randomly 1 hour later. Yeah, I've been on the plane. Okay. Right, and just came back to Slovenia. No, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and thanks so much for that. And what are you guys doing now? So basically, you constructed this in this hour, right?
Like essentially, we've kind of gone through just what the structure is, and that's when you arrived. So this maybe the last comment towards the structure, kind of in this slide, is so from here as a meta comment, like what we just talked about is kind of what I see here. It's like everybody comes in, we can recognize them as a player. Every player can propose a scene, like I proposed the scene for here, and then they can utilize this kind of structures, like say, like, okay, here's the roles available. There's a common role available, which means kind of you are what you are, like openly playing it. But I also kind of put these roles as availability, like questionnaire or summarizer. Somebody could say, hey, I made an interesting role, which is, let's say, impressionist, which is like the one who thinks always like in impressions, like, and I make it available. And then somebody says, I like that role, I throw it in my conversation as a possibility. Like that's kind of the direction. And I would propose a conversation with fairly loose rules, but the topic being like, how does that kind of organizational culture, organizational approach seem to you, like as exemplified by that description I just made? That's kind of the direction I'm thinking towards.
Can you repeat the question or phrase it in a different way?
So if you think of an organizational approach where, like, essentially you come in, you become a player. And of course, we would describe it a bit more, but like everything we know applies. But that opens up to you this possibility of every player could propose a scene, like I proposed a scene here, which is currently still maybe in this introduction because it's a big structure. But it could also be, hey, I propose a conversation, topic being this, and then I put these roles here. And that could become its own scene in itself. And if one kind of extends from there as a thought of that as a kind of organizational approach, like always like being able to create this sort of quote unquote games, and then being able to enter those games potentially in a role or a specific role, and then having this possibility of making playing moves, but also meta, which means that you could kind of turn it into a looser conversation or looser communication whenever needed. Like, how does that sound as a direction?
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, I propose a topic which is like what, and this is kind of, let's say the style. I'm making my new Converse model on the way. It has a move called style or definition called style. And the style is maybe imaginative, like to imagine. So to imagine what kind of organizational practices could that create. And I can make a first description to give maybe a sense of the style. Like I can see that as like a possibility where, so you come into this XORG and maybe into these kind of sessions to keep it simple. And there you can have an access to documents, which could be maybe a combination of Miro boards and Discord possibly, and maybe some document platform. Might be Google Docs because all hail the Leviathan of Google. But anyway, like in there could be this sort of possibilities of essentially entering games, or one can think of it like that. Or somebody could have a proposal of a game which could be a conversation, but with these rules as expanding the potential interactions around the core of normal communication. Or it could be a proposal of a pursuit, or it could be something else. It doesn't have to be so organizational. It could be just a game, like we don't have any particular pursuit out of this game, but like it could be a game of drawing. Like we could make the rules for the hair drawing, which was like you could, for example, Pablo proposed that as like you could bring some images as material, or you could give the move of bringing in new images, and then you could set the rules as like every image can be traced, and the tracings become new drawings, and then everybody or somebody else could propose, okay, when the new drawing is made, everybody has the right to name it, like to or make comments about it, and that could be a game in and of itself. So what I think or imagine is that creates an interesting overlapping that runs between something that is very project-like, that it kind of comprises everything that can be in a project, like this is what we're doing kind of thing, to play, like in the sense of like we can have any rules, it doesn't necessarily have a goal, but also creates a kind of continuum between these two. So that's my, towards this topic of imagining what this kind of organizational practice could bring to being, the style being imaginary or imagining what it could be. That's my first comment on it. But how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, if someone wants to speak, I can wait, but I have an idea. Should I go ahead? Okay. I would be interested in together speculate on potential activities that XORG might do. Like, I don't know, it keeps present in my mind the idea of how would XORG read a book, right? And sort of like we can speculate on what it means to read a book in a XORGian way. Yeah, and keep it in a meta way, in a sort of overview perspective, not to go too deep into it. And maybe we can come up with, each one of us could come up with these activities, and we could think how they would play through. Maybe that's an idea.
So I like that. I could have a comment on it, but to leave room for others, I don't make the comments yet. But I'll start by making a model called interpret. Could also be called read, but and open it just to suggest that it could be edited. Like, I think it, like, yeah, but I'll comment later.
Well, I think it's a great idea, yeah, Pablo, to apply to that, and it's an interesting question, I think, as well. Yeah, I think it's still kind of abstract. I'm just kind of grasping the kind of point of it, and I think it's a good way to explore it, yeah, in a playful manner.
Yeah, I think it's good as well, the sort of finding these common activities, let's say, of XORG, because then also sort of defines the interest of the group and the sort of trajectory as well, I guess, once these sort of activities are agreed upon.
Yeah, agreed. Like, I think it's, first of all, it's a good example or a case to maybe imagine this to use this sort of smaller case of, okay, how would we read a book? Might actually help in terms of like focusing on how it could be different. And so we could even try that. Like for me, like one thing I like about it, and I think it's something that is hopefully reflective of what this kind of structure would do, is that you always encounter this question of how do we gamify this, or how do we do it, of course, in a more general sense. Like it's not just gamification as a concept, but it's like when you're meeting reading, you can always have this layer of actually how do I interact here, because even reading is interaction. And certainly reading together is interaction, but even reading alone is interaction because your thoughts are active. But now you have this extra layer of thinking like, wait a minute, how do I do this? Like I can break the conventions, and I can design how does the interaction go. If I don't like the design, I could change the design in itself. So yeah, we could try that. I propose that we try that. Does anyone have a text in mind that could be?
Before we go into that, because you briefly mentioned interpreting as a more general term that can apply not only to books, but I guess any media, sort of like how does XORG collectively interpret information, and how that process generates knowledge in a XORGian way. Is it useful to speak to it in a general way, or do we want to focus on book and text?
I mean, I think everybody can have their own opinions. I think the book is a good example, or any document or web document, whatever, because it's not like about limiting it to that, but it's just using it as a test case. And books are kind of interesting because we read so much text anyway. So yeah, like I think it's a good case to test.
In terms of book suggestions, or maybe it's just a little bit of announcement, but today our team handed in the Slovenian translation of Governing the Commons by Eleanor Ostrom. I'm pretty happy about this.
Congratulations. Like, yeah, that's it's always like a massive task, any book translation or any other form. So congratulations are in order.
Yeah, thanks. But it's also, yeah, very, like, it's been a very intense and collaborative process, and it's related to reading, of course, but it's also its own thing involving, content, technical. Yeah, maybe it can be useful in this experiment.
Yes, could be like so what if we just pick a text like because I could let me see if I have to change the window, so I will stop sharing for a second.
Would it be useful? I don't know, and this is of course up to Rock to decide. But I went through the game you shared that you're working on. I went through the PDF yesterday, found it super interesting, and we haven't gone through it in a group way. Maybe this is an opportunity, but I don't want to impose that if you don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, of course, then it would be cool. Yeah, it's just like the tip of the iceberg of the document, but it might be a good start.
I mean, we could pick it like, do you have it quickly for sharing? I know you shared it in the Telegram group. I just have to, if it's still the same link.
Yeah, I think I send a PDF. I can also, yeah, it's not that many messages up, maybe
Yeah,
15.
I'm scrolling currently. Just have to. Oh god, now I'm probably. Yeah, luckily I stopped sharing. So this. Let me pick.
It's-
Uh, somebody finds it faster.
Above the internet. Is this a meme? Internet.
Yeah, okay, so that I'm too up. I missed it. Above the meme, yeah. You found it. So I'll share the screen for that. Let me see where did it go to share a different program. This one. And just because I'm picky, I will use my fancy JavaScript made into a link to put the colors a bit. But I'll actually post the link to like, it's actually a PDF shared within the group. So if you search for game changers, you can find it in the Telegram if you want to open it in your own window. But otherwise, it's in the screen share. We can use that screen share as well. So if we think about this, so how could we read this? Like, one thing would be to, of course, propose roles upon it, since we're making this up, this game. I can easily say edit, which should now not screen share, but that's okay. Let me put role. That could be like, in other words, named role, which is like trying to say the thing in other words. That's one role. They don't have to be this, I'm just thinking out loud. Then there is the reasoner, and by that I mean like who reads a text and thinks of the reason why the text is like this. Like reasoning behind putting those words like this, and then expresses it. And then, of course, there is the questionnaire, which thinks of questions to make upon the text. But that's just for starters, like for roles. Like any other proposals, very welcome.
Those are good. I think maybe role frame, maybe it's useful if we are able to switch roles, or if there's sort of like actions that we can take and we don't have to individually stick to them.
No, we have
maybe they're moves.
Yeah, I think we don't have to stick any of to the. Even if we pick a role, we can always kind of go outside of it, so to speak, like into the deep general, into the meta. But okay, I could break the at least to a certain sense the role of. Maybe I'll try the questionnaire. And I'll play a move about this reading, and I played from the why play this game section while reading it. And my question is, why did you want to start or say as the first reason sparks conversations from around transformational politics?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Why it put as a paragraph? You mean this? Why to play the game?
No, I meant that like when you start describing why I play this game, that whatever is the first sentence has a lot of impact, of course. And this is not a critical question. It's merely a question. It's like, why did you put first this game sparks conversations around transformational politics? And this could be a question for, of course, rock, which would be kind of like actual thing. But then anybody can play it in the speculative, which is like saying, well, isn't it like, if I had written this, I would put it for this reason.
I think it put the first sentence to sort of just incite the player, the potential player, and situate as well the sort of environment of the game within this turmoil of politics and capitalism, sort of.
This was a good speculative answer. Like you could have been the author and answer in this manner. You can also make other moves, and also propose other move types. I'm just playing around to get it going.
What do you think is the pursuit of the game? Obviously, I haven't read this, so.
No, but it's an interesting
sorry,
reading.
what with pursuit? So the goal, or
yeah, yeah, the goal.
Play itself.
As a commenter, which I'm thinking as a role now, I think like it's interesting that you take the play itself to be the pursuit. Why would you put that first as the goal of it, the play itself?
No, it's more like a cheeky answer than more like grounded.
But I would like to answer it maybe speculatively.
Yeah.
I think if the aim is to play itself, the aim becomes to generate experiences, to sort of like have the experience of existing, playing through alternative economies, and that sort of like becomes more bodily knowledge. You relate to it differently if you play it than if you think about it or read about it or see, right? So that would be my answer.
That's a good answer. I could try the speculative answer as well. Like I'm now the author. Like why the play itself is the pursuit is because it is like an intentionally alternative way of finding yourself in a political state. Like it's intentionally turning it to playful because the current politics often lacks this sense of play, and finding yourself inside political topics and political thoughts, but in a playful sense, is the key mode that I want to create. And exercising that mode is a key element of importance. So that's my speculative answer as speculative author.
I have a question. Yeah, I was very interested in how the document frames alternatives as a diversity of approaches against like this monolithic capitalism, right? So my question is, how could you open that space for this diversity of approaches to express itself while keeping a coherent narrative? I'm not sure if that's super clear. Maybe it's good that it's not.
How does plurality get to express itself?
Yes, or maybe how playing through plurality helps grasp complexity. Maybe that's like the question.
Yeah, I think answering is like as this sort of role, I suppose, more like in playing through iterations, because yeah, like you self-define yourself, and also capitalism sort of it's stated here as more like this monolithic, but it's also kind of malleable, and we could discuss also, yeah, Workian post-capitalism, etc., as a kind of seeming diametrical opposites to the quote-unquote alternatives. But yeah, I think the diversity comes through the various places, times, peoples that play this and then generate things with it, and then define roles through it, and define narratives through it, and then
So looking at
which
Czech,
is always kind of intermesh, and it's not just. Sorry.
Sorry, I was late probably. So would you say that's the need then? So to looking at the structure, like the need to understand the plurality, the diversity is this sort of, you need plurality to understand the complexity.
Yeah. I guess now that I think about it, also like the whole setup process of the game is about like you see the plurality, but then you have to make certain choices about which might reflect, you know, your own knowledge or interests or other things. It's I say it's not all, yeah, it's not just ecofeminism or just, you know, decolonial perspectives or just comments. It's always a intermesh, but there's different emphases, definitely. One, yeah, one could devise all sorts of matrices on how the different approaches approach ownership, etc.
It is also related to a concept we've talked about before, which is the slots. Like when you say that self-defined alternatives, there's an open space, right, that can be played. It is maybe the first move to think about what is my self-definition of an alternative, or maybe it's the goal to collectively figure out what that is. But I believe that sort of like this open space is very relevant and like productive and helpful. I don't know.
I started
Yeah.
another role, which is capturer, and started writing on the side like some capturings from the conversation. I just made one so far, like which is what Rock you said, like see the plurality where you have to make choices, which I thought was interesting. So captured that. So that's just a role of putting something down.
And there's also the twist. Okay, it's capitalism versus alternatives, but one of the points is actually to, through this seeming diametrical opposition, to illuminate the gray spaces and the dialectics, if you will.
Is capitalism playing the villain?
Yeah, that's it's never really explicitly stated, but that's how the narrative sort of goes, and that's how people assume roles. Yeah.
Yeah.
If it wouldn't be called a villain, but something else, what could be the word for it? Like taking this, like the role that this is giving to capitalism, what alternative definitions they could be?
The disease.
Cancer?
Cancer. Or the defect, sort of.
A natural phenomena.
Mm, a bug.
And a social construct.
A social construct, yeah. A board. This is me playing. I don't know what to call this role. It's like from another from a other perspective kind of role. So like I was trying to have this role which generates perspectives. That so the board idea was like how to look at this differently, like disease, villain, etc. And the board idea contained this that it's rather looked at as like where everything still rests. Like you create these alternatives, but they're still floating on capitalism. So so hence the game board, I guess.
Yeah, and there's of course has always been an idea of building capitalism into the board, if you will. No players of capitalism per se, but just alternatives responding to or interacting with the board as capitalism. Yeah.
In that case, capitalism is the context in which the game takes place. Would you say that?
I think
Well, if the others are alternatives, then it's the norm, it's the orthodoxy, no? It's the hegemony. Yeah, it's basically the antonym of alternatives, maybe.
Yeah, it's an alternative to what, right?
Yeah, like it's a norm default mode of things, like in some senses. I'm trying to capture this as well. Like
I like that move framing, Pablo, that you introduced. It's kind of banal, probably, but like, could imagine like going through it as like one sentence, one move, and with different roles, or I don't know, something very simple like that. I mean, a move can be many things in this context. A very basic category would be a sentence, and could be other things. Any ideas? Maybe?
yeah, since you proposed it, Pablo, you could be the keeper of it, I guess, until you run this style of play, like the one sentence in whatever way you want to run it.
The one sentence and then someone talks about it, we converse about it.
I mean, you can change you can set how the approach works and modify it if needed.
I have the thing I want to talk about.
Okay.
My highlight is area capture. What is that? It's at the beginning. What is this game? Game Changers is an area capture. I want to talk without context. I don't want to talk about game changer is or game. I want to talk about area capture.
I could say as kind of like a loose describer who is not taking things too seriously, but just describing. It's an inheritance from like culture wars and nations and kind of invasion, etc. Like or your area nation and our area nation. We invade this area. And it's about ownership of land, or comes from there. Not necessarily only that, but just as a one perspective towards it.
I feel, not knowing what necessarily means, I feel there's some sort of like conquering action within the area capture term. I might be off. No.
Yeah, no, pretty much what it is. Yeah. The idea was, yeah, to try to, well, capture these capture cooptation dynamics within a kind of game process, and it made sense. I like to make the joke, it's not yet hexagons in the game, it might be hexagons in the end. It's a simple Monopoly style thing.
To continue Pablo's highlight, I would like to ask a question about the area capture, which is like, what other ways, other terms there could be to look towards area capture or similar areas? Like, as an example, you could think of area definition, which is like who gets to define an area, which is sort of like capture, but not quite. Also, area responsibility.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, for example, is mapping area capture, or is border defining area capture?
Well, the border defines the area, you know.
Yeah, like you need some definition of the area in order to have an area, which is usually a border. Is there concept capture? And how is it defined? And could you make a game about it?
Yeah, concept capture, it's like, you could think of buzzwords floating around, like circular economy or other ones that might have come, yeah, as text also goes later on, like might have sprung up at the grassroots, but co-opted or otherwise neutralized. Or but then there's also the maybe Trojan horse dynamic.
Yeah, could also be. I think in nature, now I'm just making a loose meta role, like just talking. I think in nature, like concept capture wouldn't so much be border, it would be more into the direction of definition. Like whose definition is on front or present is probably how you capture a concept. Or at least more than like a certain, like a border like thing.
Yeah, also a concept, like, I'm not sure if you can capture it like an area, because capturing an area, it's more like, you know, you take over the area, which is defined by borders, but a concept, it's so can be fairly undefined, I guess. So it's not really a capturing, maybe it's more a commission. It's more like, you know, taking some bits, or like, you know, rather than capturing the whole concept. I mean, that obviously is plagiarism, sort of, I guess. I don't know. And what are the borders anyway? Plagiarism and taking bits, capturing bits of a concept. Maybe because it has no border, makes it harder to capture.
Maybe, like,
You
and
need
do you say
that you need to identify to capture. I had a realization right now with concept capture. Sort of, I'm thinking of
in terms of area.
I'm thinking of a dictionary, which is a place where words are kept in captivity, which is the opposite of words in language, which are ever evolving, right? So if they're in a dictionary, they are static, they're captive, and when they're just spoken around, they are dynamic. So concept capturing also implies crystallization or stallment. I don't know. Yeah, that was my revelation.
I make a question upon these topics, like, is this game a concept capture operation towards capitalism? By operation, I mean like a certain kind of like unit going somewhere and doing a certain kind of operation as part of a concept capture towards capitalism.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, the game tries to kind of run it down or dissociate in some way between like concepts, narratives, innovations, quote unquote, or initiatives. As opposed to the area itself, like some of the inspiration for the concept discourse, this environmental discourses. The area is almost like you could imagine a discursive field, or it targets kind of the discursive aspect of alternative economy transformations or what have you.
As a structural summarizer, that's a new role I made up. I would say that, and this is kind of speculative because I'm also saying this kind of almost like a speculative author, but nevertheless. So it's structural summarizer. So there is an operation that there is this concept of capitalism. And the operation goes and mines from this concept meaning. So taking some meaning of capitalism, and then taking what's mined and putting it into a state of play in the interest of altering from it, in the interest of modifying the sense of those pieces that it gets from the sense of capitalism, and leaving them in a new modified sense of those pieces. As an allegorist, I could describe this mine, which is this network, and there are these veins, which are another network that are called capitalism. It's the mine in meaning, and they go and they knock out pieces from it, and they put them in a laboratory and they change in nature, and then they leave them in this changed state. And they put the people actually to be the lab people who make these operations, the players.
Are you talking about mutation?
Kind of.
Could some of the alternatives in this game be capitalist mutations, or are those off the table?
Yeah, that's been the idea, like how to go into the nitty-gritty of that gray space mentioned before, and also kind of like alternatives then at some point could be, you know, the players themselves like step over to the other side and vice versa. It's not there yet, but definitely, yeah, something.
I have a question. I see at the bottom you write, since conception that a game came out by a collective, right? That's curious as well. That's concept capture somehow.
Yeah, it's
How does that differs with your idea? Is it very, very similar?
it's not that similar really, but yeah, no, it just feels maybe change might be in order. It's become a bit too mainstream as game changers notion.
A question for Pablo as a keeper of this sentence. Can I highlight another sentence to focus on?
Yes, of course.
I'll pick from the middle part of the story chapter. There's in order to break through glass ceilings present in different alternative economic contexts, sharing, solidarity, smart, circular. And I want to bring the breakthrough glass ceilings present in different alternative economic contexts, and this list. And I would ask, what does this mean? Which is, of course, a question for you, Rock, but also a question for everyone, because everybody can speculate what does it mean that these are glass ceilings, sharing, solidarity, smart, circular.
Yeah, if there's any speculations, otherwise I can.
I believe this is framing these ideas as actionable. So how can this be turned into something that has the power to break glass in this context? I mean, I know it's metaphorical, but it's how can sharing or solidarity, that's I guess better as an example, how is solidarity actionable, and how is that being even violent towards capitalism, right? How can these alternatives be utilized in a practical way, turning them to verbs maybe?
I would say that these concepts like solidarity are glass ceilings because they present a virtue, like something that is, at least in the case of solidarity, that is kind of sense of something that is good in itself, but then because it's that kind of a sense of things, that it's a virtue, it becomes a kind of glass ceiling. It's very hard to break that. It's very hard to question it in itself. Um, uh, and maybe that can create this sort of situation where you're entrapped by that concept, or a certain kind of economic development is entrapped by that concept. So in a way, like solidarity can become a trap by a community that is for solidarity, and yeah.
Wrong. Yeah, joking.
No, it's a valid move.
Mm-hmm.
Say
Yeah,
wrong.
no, that's why I like that. Yeah, there was like this very minus 100 points. The specific article that I came across, like our team translated like this Green State book a few years back. And the same author, like a few years later, there's this a special issue of a journal on the glass ceiling of socio-ecological transformations. And it's used somewhat outside its original context, i.e. barriers to advancement of minorities and women within corporate hierarchy. But here it has just a sort of fancy or more paint a picture sort of way of saying like the structural barriers or certain trajectories of change preset and how to break through those. And the implication is that different new economy contexts will different strategies will be needed, and those glass ceilings might qualitatively differ, like in the milieus, if you will, that form both locally and trans-locally around, smart city versus social and solidarity economy. It's not necessarily a versus there, but get my point.
I think that's true, but also wrong. So if we take, for example, this term smart and smart city, etc., I would describe the pattern of these things that whenever they come in, they do propose something new. So this is what it's right about it. Like they propose something like a different kind of order. But then what happens quite quickly is that there becomes this sort of convention of how to do, for example, how to create a smart city. It's like, oh, you have your own Silicon Valley, and then you put this and this kind of funding and so on. And then they become repeats of this pattern. And then they also become pressure points that you should have a smart city. And that means all of the kind of above structures in itself. And then they become their own glass ceilings in a way, like that it's almost like a local optima. Like there comes this sort of new mountain that starts to grow, but then it conventionalizes, and then that convention becomes like a block in itself that it starts to block, and in this sense, it's a glass ceiling.
Yeah, making a move other than noted. Don't say noted.
Which sentence or phrase you would like to highlight from here, Rock, as a question?
Sorry, highlight a sentence as a question. So,
As a question to you, which sentence you would like to highlight?
Hmm.
Thank you, Pecco. Thank you,
Okay.
Rock. Thank you, Pablo.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks, Linda, for taking part. Like, I can tell you later
Yeah, no worries.
summary of this,
Yeah.
but it's completely understandable, and I think we would soon move to a summary anyway. But yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao,
Bye.
ciao.
So, like in the middle of the document in purple, we have a community platform called Anticipedia. So my question is, what do you guys imagine under Anticipedia? Either just the term in of itself or within the context of
The
this.
term is great. It's very evocative. It's sort of like, I related to anticipation. I don't know if that's correct, but like what frames alternatives in very clearly potential way, like they are going to happen. It frames potentials as if they will happen, and sort of like gives it a framing of anticipation that makes them palpable, and I like that. Like it's very evocative.
Yeah, for me, it also brings this the sense of potential, like, of course, relating to the topics given that they are at hand, like that have been discussed earlier, like how potential is in a form of actual, like it's a definition, but it's a definition that could be, and which sets it into this interesting space that is, it can be just as defined as a thing that is actual, something that we have to respect, but it's not there yet. There is a pathway, maybe even unknown pathway to get there, and it kind of relates to me as well towards Anticipedia. Like maybe as an addition, I could say that as an act, an Anticipedia or creating an Anticipedia would be urging towards certain potentials. Like it would be a move to highlight those anticipations in order to make them more strongly present, like make their coulds known.
Yeah, for sure. I've written this name in a bunch of different contexts. This is certainly not the first one. I imagine it maybe to be, a platform to use it for all those things. It's indeed like a combination of anticipation and wiki, and that like notion of wiki commenting, and in this context of generative gaming or whatnot, like to have a kind of resource. It's not just a map of alternatives or a map of maps, or a survey where you can put up your own initiative. It's a way to play with that content in different ways.
From the role of a callbacker, making connections, or referist maybe, I would say what you're doing with Anticipedia is conceptual capturing. So you're making moves of conceptual capturing by mentioning it in many places, essentially. But what is the game you're playing when you're making these conceptual capturings by writing Anticipedia in many places. What's the game there?
Well, yeah, the game is a cool concept. Put it out there, get people's imaginations going. I mean, concept in terms of like fairly self-evident kind of point. I guess the game has to, yeah, get people inspired and make it real.
I think that's really interesting that if you just put it in different contexts, maybe the game is a game of exploration where how the concept is defined emerges from the sum of all of these contextual appearances.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about that as a game. Like, I would describe what you describe, Rock, as strategy. Like, that there is a game, a kind of a game, or game-like thing around it, and then you choose the strategy of which you just described to approach it. And maybe it's probably a game of language, at least. It's maybe other games as well, but game of language in general.
Yeah, I think the original inspiration was, I mean, one of was the Open Futures Library initiative by a colleague, or just the proof of concept with a bunch of scenarios on a website with some searchable terms. Yeah, kind of, and combining that with generative gaming, something that's, and then yeah, it appears here. It appears in the For Futures Festival idea, which is like about crafting together like yeah, scenarios of speculative futures, like archetypical futures, growth, collapse, discipline, and transformation in different contexts, you know, or meta, or everything. But then Anticipedia would, yeah, both like it would afford these kinds of like co-designing experiences, but then you also plug in game changers, and it, you know, facilitates like the generation of new challenges and interventions that then players play within the game, or new iterations of the game itself, kind of plugging in new things into the concept and seeing, you know, what comes out, and then from that seeing what comes later.
As a scenarioist or imaginist, those two roles made up, I could imagine if I'm entering the Anticipedia, and what I see is a description of a state of something, like not nation state, but state of things. And then underneath it, there is this pathways or coulds, essentially, of how this state could be arrived to. And maybe multiple ones, multiple coulds of what kind of things are taking towards that state, which would create this sort of anticipation sense. Like, here is a state, here's how it could be arrived.
Mm. Yeah, it also opens like this epistemological and ontological questions relating to future, the future futures, or futurity. Like, you know, future as predetermined versus open, but you know, many other things.
as a game designer, the game called Anticipedia could work sort of as follows. Anybody can describe a state of something, and then other players can make moves of adding how we could reach the state, which can be like conflicting, whatever. So somebody describes a state, writes it, talks it out, whatever, and then other players make moves of like starting from here, whatever the here is, this is how we could get there. Then in the next turn, somebody else describes a state, and other players create short moves of telling how could we get there. And like together, those that kind of gameplay could create Anticipedia. Hence, it's a game called Anticipedia. A game of Anticipedia.
And foresight and futures, they would call that backcasting. Yeah, that was one of the early ideas. It lends itself quite well to quote-unquote gamification. I was exploring this bit as well, like foresight and futures methods. And yeah, there's still a very active group around this Anticiplay, it's called. I mentioned it maybe once.
Sorry, what was it called? I didn't hear.
Anticiplay. It's a relatively new group. It's a project by my former master's mentor, Josef Fort. But it's essentially about quote-unquote anticipatory governance in games. Like here, it's games and organizations, vice versa. There, it's like anticipatory governance in games and vice versa. Friend is I also invited him. Like last week, I couldn't make it. So it was like, yeah, I'm having a chat with him. He just came from Canada to Utrecht for a little bit. Well, I mentioned, and yeah, I think they will, him and his girlfriend will join up in one of the sessions soon.
Oh, that's great.
He's working on like utopian processes in games and like also like hacking games to like eco games, hacking game like normal games into eco games and things like that. That could be really interesting.
It would be, yeah. Like, and I also like. This is a general comment. I like the looking forward, the anticipation way better than backcasting, because like backcasting is almost thinking that the real thing is the future, which is not the real thing, and then you backcast from there. But future is always in an imaginative state. Like actually, future behaves more like the concept of utopia than the concept of future. Like it's always imagined. But then, like, if you're looking forwards from that, that opens you up into like how do we construct towards this in a, I think, more sensible way than thinking that it's some kind of pseudo real and then you backcast from there. Further game designer comment. I think, of course, many games could be designed around it, but I think there is maybe a strong mechanic in the sense of being able to describe any kind of a state and then putting people into the kind of strategic set or impulse or desire to describe pathways from there, because the pathways are a challenge. Of course, describing states is a challenge as well, but it's equally a challenge to find pathways towards them. So hitting those 2 points, the describing the states and describing the pathways, is kind of hitting on the major knots of anticipation.
And could also very well be framed in terms of actuality and potentiality.
Yeah, it's very much the similar in the similar area.
And prefiguration.
Mm. As a meta comment, so this was reading, or an example of it. If we would have been more diligent about it, I mean, we recorded quite a bit, but if we would have time, it would be sensible to write down the different approaches, roles, etc. From it, because you can. I think many of the approaches are actually quite interesting and have some like even general use. But as overall, I quite like this as a take on reading, because I mean, it would have been, I think, probably interesting, but I think less fertile and certainly less kind of creative if we would have done the normal thing, like let's all read through and discuss. Which is kind of the point of these kind of structures, like where we started off with.
Yeah, totally. This was a very XORG approach to reading. I liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I'd be happy to volunteer and make some more detailed notes based on the recording. So I have a bit more time now, and also like it's the game and XORG.
That would be great. Do you have access to the Miro board? You can put them anywhere really, but like just as a practical question.
Yeah, yeah.
You have? Okay, good. Just to make that sure, because like detailed notes would be great. Because I both like this as a practice, but also like said, like this picture of when one thinks about any kind of process, if the general state is we can be as loose and normal and free, whatever word one uses, as we are normally, but there's always this possibility of adding interactions and use those to channel things, and easy ways to communicate those interactions, and also create kind of like their own scopes, like scenes to focus on a certain kind of interaction. And I think there is something towards XORG as operation style in that direction, that kind of approach.
All right.
Yes. All right. So let's have, I'll stop screen sharing. We could have, I don't know, final thoughts. The scene now, final thoughts. You can say them loosely or use any kind of role or approach you want.
We should do this again, like collective reading as a XORG activity could really emerge into a interesting dynamic.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a very fruitful, like kind of question you posed.
Yeah, and also like the reading games. It's actually an area that I had a project many years ago, like in games of interpretation and reading, like how to play around the reading. I call it reading, like, you know, with W before, like writing reading, so reading. Uh, 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 but I like, as a memory of that, it's a very fertile area. Like, and of course, it's not just text; it could be anything. It could be film, picture, whatever. But text is actually very useful for it. And if we go visit the area, like recording some rules, it will populate the area of reading games call them whatever, which in itself is, I think, quite a useful development.
Yeah, also a lot of potential for asynchronous play in, for example, a Discord channel that I see, yeah, could be very productive.
Yeah. Yeah, like Discord play, link to a document, quotes, like there's some much flexibility given that the platforms are text friendly, like in that. And it's a really interesting mode because if you have to also write your answers, it might be a limitation, but it's also maybe useful that you're in the same medium where the text is. And of course you can have, you know, chat as well over like or talking. Yeah, let's think about that. Maybe that's an area to develop in itself. And so, but hey, thanks for being here, and I do think it's promising, this direction overall. That it's not an accident that we ended up with these reading games and kind of already a case of it because we took this kind of approaches. And of course, they need more codification and detailing and blah blah. But I do think like that's something that is good to keep in mind for the future. And next week, no session because Christmas. We have to obey the gods of Santa and Satan, and I won't tell the complicated story of how they are related because it will take a couple of hours. But they are. Also, Woden and Santa are highly related. Anyway, I'll stop. So what we'll do is, because then the next session would be on the New Year's Eve, we'll rather have a Telegram chat on when to have the next session in slightly abnormal time, so that we don't have too long a break. So that's the practicalities of it.
Perfect.
Sounds good. And just like last 2 cents and thinking out loud, yeah, but I guess like, book reading is a really interesting one. I guess we can think of a bunch of activities, like I mean, very obvious one, but collaborative writing or like experimental types of writing. Like a very obvious one is like an exquisite corpse approach or something, but you know, we could take it in a lot of places.
Yeah, like actually, I have a bunch of them because once you do reading, you are already in writing. The one thing that when you start playing with it, it's that they become super close because they are kind of like, in order to write, you must be able to read. That seems like an obvious thing, but it actually, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that most of the writing is actually reading. Like you write something and then you immediately read it, and the reading is actually the evaluation of the writing. Like, so once you start doing reading games, you are already like this close to a writing game. Every form you make. So that's another thing I noticed, and like I think starting from reading is good, and if we keep the perspective or lens or filter of writing games on the side, they will kind of start to produce themselves as well. But yeah, it's an interesting area. There's a lot, like you take a role in writing similarly as in reading, like all of this works. You open a discussion on a sentence or a topic, or like all of this works. Anyway, but that's another topic to visit. But hey, yeah, thanks. I will do the honors, quote unquote, of stopping the recording.